When George R. Martin's Fire and Blood was adapted into HBO's House of the Dragon, Daemon Targaryen became one of the characters whose story was changed, rearranged, and expanded the most. The two versions share many of the same major events, but the journey between those events is often completely different. In the book, Daemon's story begins with his involvement in the Stepstones, where he fights alongside Corlys Velaryon against the Crab Feeder and eventually declares himself king of the Stepstones and the Narrow Sea. The war lasts for years, and Daemon eventually abandons the Stepstones after the death of his first wife, Rhea Royce, before marrying Laena Velaryon. The show compresses this entire period dramatically. Season 1 presents the Stepstones campaign as a major early storyline, with Daemon and Corlys fighting the Crab Feeder, and Daemon personally taking part in the final attack that kills him. The book, however, does not give us the same detailed cinematic sequence of Daemon crawling through the battlefield and personally killing the Crab Feeder. The adaptation turns a broader military campaign into a much more personal victory for Daemon. Another important difference comes with Rhea Royce. In Fire and Blood, Rhea dies after suffering an accident while hawking, and Daemon later attempts to claim her inheritance at Runestone but fails. The show instead gives Daemon a direct encounter with Rhea, where he attacks her and leaves her mortally injured, creating a much more explicit connection between Daemon and her death. After this, the book has Daemon marry Laena Velaryon, and the couple spend years in Pentos before eventually returning to Driftmark. The show follows the marriage but changes its presentation considerably and makes Laena's death a major emotional event. After becoming unable to deliver her child, she chooses to die by dragonfire from Vhagar rather than remain alive while suffering. In the book, Laena also dies after a difficult childbirth, but her final circumstances are different, and Daemon's involvement is not presented exactly as it is on television. Season 1 also changes the circumstances surrounding Daemon and Rhaenyra's relationship. In Fire and Blood, their relationship develops over time and eventually results in marriage after Laena's death and after Harwin Strong's death and the disappearance of Rhaenyra's first husband, Lenor Velaryon. The show dramatically expands their relationship and gives them a much more complicated sequence of encounters before they finally marry. Most importantly, the show creates an elaborate deception surrounding Lenor's supposed death. In the book, Lenor is killed at a fair in Spicetown by Sir Carl Corey, and this allows Daemon and Rhaenyra to marry. The show changes the event completely. Daemon and Rhaenyra secretly arrange for Laenor to escape with Quarrel, while another man is killed and presented as Laenor. This means that in the television version, Daemon and Rhaenyra marry, believing that Lenor is alive somewhere in Essos, whereas the book treats Lenor as genuinely dead. That change becomes especially important because the show has effectively removed the possibility of Daemon being directly responsible for Laenor's death. Then comes the Dance of the Dragons, and this is where the differences become even larger. After Lucerys Velaryon's death, Daemon in the book immediately seeks revenge against the Greens. Through Mysaria, he arranges the horrifying blood and cheese assassination inside the Red Keep. The two assassins are able to reach Queen Helena and her children, and Prince Jaehaerys is murdered. The show retains the basic idea that Daemon is behind the revenge operation, but changes how the killers are recruited, how the plan unfolds, and how directly Daemon communicates his intentions. The book makes the murder part of a larger chain of revenge following Lucerys' death, whereas the show spends more time dramatizing the uncertainty and chaos surrounding the operation. After this, Daemon's military role becomes extremely important. In Fire and Blood, he captures Harrenhal very quickly, and the castle's defenders surrender. He then uses Harrenhal as a strategic base while the Riverlords begin gathering for Rhaenyra. The television series takes this relatively simple military event and transforms Harrenhal into one of Daemon's longest storylines. Instead of simply capturing the castle and moving forward, the show places him there for an extended period and introduces Alice Rivers as a major character in his story. Daemon experiences strange visions and encounters that do not have an Ikiwaki. Daemon experiences strange visions and encounters that do not have an equivalent sequence in Fire and Blood. The television version therefore turns Harrenhal from a military headquarters into a supernatural and psychological storyline. In the book, Deamon's military campaign continues much more rapidly. He takes Harrenhal, helps bring the Riverlands toward Rhaenyra's cause, and eventually participates in the Blacks campaign that results in the capture of King's Landing. When Rhaenyra takes the capital, Deamon becomes one of the most important figures in her regime. The show follows the capture of King's Landing but changes the circumstances surrounding Deamon's involvement and the political consequences afterward. One of the biggest differences is that the book's Deamon is much more directly involved in the military campaign across the Riverlands, while the television series spends a considerable amount of time keeping him separated from Rhaenyra. The book also makes Deamon's relationship with the young dragon rider Nettles extremely important. Nettles rides Sheepstealer and becomes one of the dragon riders fighting for Rhaenyra. Deamon and Nettles are eventually sent together to hunt Aemon Targaryen and Vhagar. This becomes one of the most important parts of Deamon's final story, and it is an element the television adaptation has not reproduced in exactly the same form. The Battle of the Gullet is another major event where Deamon's story intersects with the wider war. In the book, the Triarchy attacks the Valyrian fleet, breaking the blockade of King's Landing, and Jacaerys Velaryon is killed. Deamon is not simply sitting at Harrenhal throughout the war. He is part of the larger military struggle and continues fighting for Rhaenyra. Meanwhile, the Greens begin recovering from their earlier setbacks. Eventually, Aemond and Deamon become increasingly important enemies, and the two princes are essentially hunting one another. In the show, their rivalry is developed through a much more personal storyline, especially through their shared connection to Harrenhal. Season 2's extended Harrenhal material is therefore a significant adaptation choice. The book gives Deamon a strategic military role there, while the show uses the castle to explore visions, prophecy, Alice Rivers, and Deamon's connection to the larger Targaryen future. Season 3 continues to build on this adaptation, while also moving the war toward the events at Tumbleton and the wider collapse of Rhaenyra's position. Current Season 3 episodes have already begun setting up the famous betrayal of Ulf White and Hugh Hammer, although those events unfold differently from the book, and the season is still reaching its finale. The final and perhaps greatest difference between the book and show versions of Deamon comes with Nettles and Aemond. In Fire and Blood, Rhaenyra eventually becomes convinced that Nettles has become Deamon's lover and orders her death. When Deamon learns about the order, he does not betray Nettles. Instead, he secretly allows her to escape with Sheepstealer. Nettles flies away, and Deamon then makes a decision that leads directly to his death. He announces that he is going to Harrenhal, where Aemond and Vhagar are located. Deamon is no longer simply searching for Aemond, he is deliberately going to confront him. This is important because the book's ending for Daemon is not an accident or an ordinary battlefield death. It is the culmination of his pursuit of Aemond. The two finally meet above the God's Eye, with Deamon riding Caraxes and Aemond riding Vhagar. The battle becomes one of the most spectacular dragon fights described in the entire history of the Targaryens. Caraxes attacks Vhagar in the sky, and both dragons become locked together as they fall toward the lake. At the decisive moment, Deamon leaves Caraxes and leaps onto Vhagar. He drives the Valyrian sword Darksister directly through Aemon's empty eye socket, killing him. Both men and both dragons then plunge into the God's Eye. Vhagar and Aemond eventually remain at the bottom of the lake, while Caraxes survives long enough to crawl back to shore before dying from his wounds. Deamon's body, however, is never recovered. That missing body creates one of the greatest mysteries surrounding Deamon's death. Officially, the historical accounts consider him dead at the battle above the God's Eye, but because his corpse was never found, stories later appeared claiming that he survived the fall and somehow escaped to find Nettles. The historical account generally rejects that possibility, but the uncertainty is deliberately left in the story.